Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Our guest today is William Pomeranz. Will is Deputy Director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, and he's the author of this new book, Law and the Russian State, Russia's Legal Evolution from Peter the Great to Vladimir Putin. Will, congratulations on the completion of the book and welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So I always like the background of an author, the decision making. When did you decide to write this book, and then how long did it take you from the inception to the conclusion?
Well, I like to think I've been working on this book for a lifetime. My background is in Russian legal history, but also for my...
And you've practiced law.
I became a lawyer and practiced law in Moscow as well. So I've been collecting information for the better part of 3 decades. But my decision to write this book was Bloomsbury Press contacted me and asked me if I wanted to write a book.
So they said, take all that information you've been gathering for decades out of your head and put it onto paper.
Exactly. And there was nothing like the incentive of actually having a contract and knowing that it was going to be published to convince me to get up early on Saturdays and Sundays to write the book.
So when people think about Russia currently or through time, when they think of any autocratic state, they think of a certain lawlessness, or at least just a singular top-down law, almost fiat. Is that the most productive way to think about Russia? How should we think about Russia in terms of the law?
Well, I think the best way to understand Russian law is to understand the centrality of the state and the central role that the state plays in governing a multinational, continent-wide space, and then understand how they use law in order to advance their interests, so that we don't kind of immediately look for rule of law. We don't necessarily look for kind of continuity in long-standing institutions, but understanding how a state, a multinational state, uses law to maintain itself in power.
And you make the point in the book that the state, this entity, it has outlived the Tsars and the communists and will likely outlive Vladimir Putin.
The state is always there. And
that is the constant.
It is the constant, and as I say, you can put any adjective you want in front of it. It can be the autocratic state, it can be the socialist state, it can be the democratic state, but the principles of the state, and what I argue in the book is the notion of state and law, is a constant throughout all 3 regimes.
I had a habit of romanticizing the notion of rule of law until a legal scholar told me, well, rule of law is only worthwhile in the pursuit of justice. Rule of law can be used for all types of things, which adds way more nuance to this. So in the context of this study of the Russian law and the Russian state, who does the law serve?
Well, the law serves the state.
Not the people.
Well, it also serves the people as well. And so what I focus on is, instead of focusing of the rule of law or how people use law, is to focus on this notion that is emphasized in Russia, and that is the notion of legality. And that has a variety of different definitions and nuances. It can mean, in its broadest sense, the supremacy of law. But what I focus on here is legality as a notion of law-abidingness. That what the state expects both its bureaucrats and its citizens to do is to observe the law, to fulfill the law. Mm-hmm. But the law is not necessarily used to challenge the power of the state or the ruler of the state or the autocrat.
So you've taught too?
Yes.
And so if you were teaching a law class and there was a Russian student and an American student, how much are the definitions and the concepts interchangeable in a one-to-one way, or how much do you have to make it clear that there's a difference? And the reason I bring this up, I think of one of the points you make in the book is about where law comes from, and that in an American context we would think of the legislature being the body that makes law. Not the case in Russia.
Not the case in Russia. The law comes, for the most part, from the bureaucracy and from the ruler. And so, not surprisingly, the law reflects the interests of the bureaucracy and the ruler, and that is how you have to approach the continuity within Russian law.
So the terms might be the same, but the actual meanings are different.
The terms are very different as well.
Uh-huh.
And so what I tried to do in the book is really kind of find the continuous terms that are used throughout the 3 regimes. And identify what they have in common.
What are those key terms?
So the key terms are notions of legality that I've mentioned, notions of state power, state power that is not accountable to the people, but is ruling by itself. Notions of organs of state power that are subordinate to the state, that are part of what you mentioned as the top-down legality of how to fulfill the orders from the center. And finally, the notion of what I call the unified state. And the unified state goes back to late Tsarist legal philosophers. But I found that it was really the best framework in which to understand the role of law in its long-time evolution. And what the unified state stands for, especially in the Tsarist time, but you can make that, you can argue that it has persisted, is that the state requires that its citizens and its peoples recognize the sovereignty of the state, the absolute power of the state. And once it recognizes that there's only one sovereign, then the state is very flexible in terms of how it deals with everyday matters of law. Remember that an empire, any empire, whether it's the Russian Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, doesn't necessarily mean that there's one system of law. Indeed, they have lots of flexibility of how they use the law. And I think this is what you need to understand about Russia, that as law evolved in the 18th and 19th century, there wasn't one Russian law. There were multiple legal systems within the Russian Empire. And that was a stable system in its own way, except that late Tsarist policies tried to Russify Russian society, which meant kind of expanding Russian law to areas where it hadn't really governed before.
In Western democracies, often a lot is made about the need for the populace to trust the state, trust the laws, trust the courts. What is the level of trust among the Russian people over time of its state?
Again, it varies, but there's a surprisingly high trust within the state, or at least the state that's going to provide stability over, again, this
to manage civil disputes and things of that
exactly
nature.
and have the flexibility so that today a dispute in the Caucasus is handled differently than a dispute in Moscow or St. Petersburg. And so the state allows this element of stability, of flexibility. Law, especially in the Tsarist period, was pluralistic. It wasn't one law that governed the entire Russian Empire. It was different in the Soviet period, and there are differences even today. But again, the continuity is of the state and the recognition of one sovereign. And after that, the state can be flexible in terms of how it applies the law.
When you've used terms a lot like stability and continuity, over the course of the period that you cover in the book, what do we see if we were putting it on a graph? Is it a fairly constant movement, or are there peaks and valleys?
There are definitely peaks and valleys. So I think that if you look from Peter the Great to the end of the Tsarist period, you can see examples of steady reform. Most notably introduced in 1864 and the judicial reforms, not to go into too many details, but it created independent judiciary, a independent legal profession, and really an engaged system of at least private law, so that you allowed for private property and economic growth. So I think you have a steady growth and appreciation of what role law can play. The Soviets tear that down and create their own legal system. It's one of the few kind of lasting, important aspects of the Soviet society. They continue a notion of custom, but they had destroyed the custom that had existed in Tsarist times, and they can't recreate a new custom under socialist law. What is most glaring, what I emphasize in the book, is that the Soviet regime has its own unique system of private law, but it marginalizes private law so much that it really isn't in a position to adapt when Gorbachev comes and wants to actually introduce commercial law reforms in the Soviet Union.
Now, you say you've been working on this book informally your entire career.
Yes.
But when you actually began the process of consolidating it into one narrative over time and doing additional research, did anything change in your thinking? Did anything surprise you?
I think I had a clear idea going into it. I think the one thing that is surprising, and I think it's not my discovery, but it's other historians, is that when they look at the early Tsarist legal system, whether it's Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Nicholas I, they find that at least in terms of going to court and pursuing one's rights in court, that the legal system was improving already back then. That it wasn't this kind of picture of corruption, and it wasn't simply a dysfunctional legal system. You can find elements of practicality within the system, even though, and from an American perspective, we would think it not possible, there are no real lawyers in this legal system. Legal education only begins in the 1830s in Tsarist Russia.
One of the things that surprised me about your conclusions in the book is this notion of contradictions that occur throughout, and that it's both a strong state and a weak state. I would have assumed strong going in. Can you explain that?
Yes, so the strong state is that it has a remarkable ability to reach into the life of any single citizen and dramatically change that life.
Which is the image most people have from the outside looking in.
But the weak state was the Russian state, again, in the Tsarist period, it didn't really have the resources to extend its reach down to that individual level. And it was a weak state in the sense that it allowed for other legal systems to evolve within it. It allowed for property rights, and property rights expanded significantly in the period after Catherine the Great. And so what surprised me was the beginnings of reform that occurred within the autocracy, with the clear understanding that it was always an attempt to promote a top-down legality, which you talked about at the beginning. They were less interested in the commercial side and the civil law side of Russian law prior to really the 1860s. What
would you say is the 30,000-foot view takeaway if you were going to tell a law student who's studying this? What is the thing that is most important to understand about the Russian state and its legal system?
That you have to understand how Russian law works within the context of governing an empire. And if you are looking for rule of law, accountability, a vibrant legislature, separation of powers, human rights, you're not going to necessarily find it within the way you understand it from a Western concept. But if you deeper into Russian law, you will find different approaches to law, and you will find that those questions are addressed in different ways. So the best example really is today on the question of human rights. There is obviously this perception, and it's not untrue, of the difficulty of enforcing human rights in Russia. But at the same time, you have opportunities to pursue litigation, not just in Russia, but also in the European Court of Human Rights. I can assure you from an American standpoint, the idea that you somehow could take a case outside the U.S. judicial system and pursue it is a long way from ever happening. You also have the question of what rights do people want to defend. And what's interesting from the Russian context is really the path to rights is through social rights. That's a hangover from the Soviet period, but those are the rights that Russians most actively pursue and defend. And it is not impossible to think that Russia's approach to rights and civil rights goes through the expansion and the enforcement of these social rights, which would be a very different evolution from the United States, which obviously started with property rights and used property rights as a means to pursue broader civil rights.
Looking ahead to the sequel.
Yes.
How much does a legal system like this hold a country back as far as full participation globally and the benefits, economic benefits that could come with that? And is reform in Russia's future, further legal reform in Russia's future?
Obviously, how it holds Russia back is that Western investors looking to see if they want to put their money into Russia are even today very hesitant because they don't trust the legal system, because they fear political instability, they fear the role of sanctions. There's lots of reasons why Westerners would be hesitant to invest in Russia. And part of it is they don't believe that they can trust the legal system. Fortunately, there are ways around that. International lawyers know that it's you can arbitrate in London or in Stockholm, and you don't necessarily have to use the Russian courts. And that's an alternative that exists
Find a friendly
today.
jurisdiction.
Exactly, and that's a way that people pursue investment in Russia today. So it doesn't preclude investment, but it makes people hesitant about it. Is reform in Russia's future? I think absolutely. And because I think as Russia changes, as the old Soviet generation leaves power, Putin is still part of that generation. He still has at least 5 years to go and maybe more. But I think there will be a recognition that the legal system has to change. But they will be confronted with all the same problems that Russia has confronted in the past when they deal with the issue of legal reform. They will have to ask the question, if we decentralize, what happens, how do we continue to hold this country together when we have regions and nationalities that will want to assert greater independence, especially from
the empire question.
The empire question. Yeah. They will also have to face the question of how much will they allow for private wealth? And will private wealth be able to challenge the prerogatives of the state? They'll have to address the role of institutions and how to make sure that judges in criminal cases can actually act independently, how to change the prosecutor's office and so forth. So they will be confronted with all the questions that are left unresolved throughout Russian history. And they will confront the same issues that confronted 19th century reformers, 20th century reformers, and 21st century reformers.
Will, thank you. Congratulations on the achievement.
Thank you very much.
Glad you can glean your Saturday mornings back.
Yes.
The author is Will Pomeranz. The book is Law in the Russian State. Thanks for joining us. Hope you'll join us again for another edition of Wilson Center Now. Thanks again, Will.
My pleasure.